Hi everybody, this is Craig Tanner for The Mindful Eye and the Daily Critique. Today's image was submitted by Doug, who's an advanced photographer from Washington State. Doug recently created this image on the Mindful Eye's Death Valley National Park workshop. Doug used a medium to long telephoto here to isolate a part of a badlands in an area of Death Valley National Park called Golden Canyon. And because we were there with Doug, we know that Bob here, who was another participant on the workshop, is really the main subject of the image. So I want to start off talking about what I like about this image, and then I want to spend a few minutes today. There's not really anything in this image that I want to change, so the reason that I chose this image is I want to talk about the way that the average viewer is looking at printed media and how this path that the average viewer takes or wants to take ends up having a pretty big impact on the idea of visual design in terms of whether the design of our image either creates a pleasing feeling for the viewer where there's a feeling that they can move through the image in a way that's natural or feels unified, or there's more of a jarring image for the viewer. Obviously, both ways of creating images could be very important and very valid depending on what it is you're trying to communicate. When I look at this image, one of the things I love is how quality of light is working really well for what Doug is trying to say. This real low side light is creating a lot of dimension in the subject of Bob himself. There's also creating at this angle a really beautiful shadow behind Bob. So in addition to just the quality of light on Bob, the negative space of the shadow behind Bob helps him to come forward and separate. And not only that, but the shape of the highlight and shadows here immediately sets up a really beautiful repetition or rhythm. If you look at Bob's shape, you're really looking at a whole series of semicircles, both in the positive and negative space shapes that are being suggested here. And then you've got a highlight semicircle here and these really beautiful undulating circles, and that moves in a real dynamic way. And when you look at the quality of light in the rest of the image, you're seeing the same thing. Lighting that at one time creates dimension and separation of subjects, but also a lighting pattern with highlight and shadow where the shapes of highlights and shadows are rhyming and are very repetitious over and over and over again in the image, and that's really beautiful. I also love the simplicity of having two diagonals that have a design that sort of carries you through the image in a consistent way, where those diagonals crosshatch. Most of your shading and high contrast happens along this diagonal, and then it kind of arcs a little bit off the diagonal, and then most of the highlight and open areas and areas that are lower contrast happen on this diagonal. And I just love the simplicity of that cross-hatching. I also love the way Doug is working with harmony of color here. You know, if Bob was carrying, let's say, a pack that was some very bright fluorescent color, let's say like a bright yellow, or his hat is bright green, then this shot becomes an image of a backpack or a hat or some piece of apparel. But because the colors that Bob is wearing really harmonize with this section of Golden Canyon, you get a really beautiful feeling of the light separating Bob, but then color design connecting Bob to everything else. And that's a really beautiful, again, rhythm or repetition or unity. You've got obviously tan and a lot of tan back here. You have this red and then burnt red here. You have a little bit of exposed skin that's sort of more of an orange warm color that gets harmonized here. And there's a color theory thing that's happening here that I love, that is a great way to work with dynamic symmetry, and that is you get this real subtle sense in some of these shadow areas of a very muted sort of cyan, and then it gets real concentrated right here in one small spot. Same thing with these very muted sort of burnt reds, and then it gets concentrated in the idea of the backpacks. Really beautiful harmony of color, but at the same time within that harmony of color a very dynamic feeling of symmetry and dynamic balance. This is the main thing that I wanted to talk about today. You know, we've talked about the hierarchy of how the eye goes first to the area of highest contrast, then highlights, then warm tones, then mid-tones, then cool tones, shadow areas with detail, and the mind skips black with no detail. There's something else that's going on. We've been trained for years and years and years in the West to read from left to right, and we have been trained to go to the top left and then move to the right. And we also know that it's easier to move from up to down than it is to move from down to up. And we also know something else. We know that because we start in the left, that all things being equal, let's say this was a totally grayed out rectangle or a white rectangle or black rectangle, even in that case where everything within the rectangle is the same, we know that the left hand side, particularly the top left, and then followed by the left middle and the lower left, this side, with all things being equal, has a lot more visual weight than the right side, because this is where we go. And that ends up potentially being very important if we want to create a scenario for the viewer that is familiar and feels like it's easy for them to move around and is unified with the way they typically look at printed media on a page. And this image is just a classic example of an image that has been arranged to facilitate that movement. When you go to the top left here, all of these lines start to move down, which is easy movement, and they move quite a ways through the image before they are interrupted. And then once this movement does get interrupted, you have this real high contrast shadow that starts to move us back around, and Bob himself moves us back around in a very powerful way from all this image. If we're going to move in a circle in the west looking at something, it's much easier for us to go clockwise than it is for us to go this way around. And boy, does this image have a very strong sense of design that can pull you back around in this way. Here's something else that's true that we really don't think about that much when it comes to design. If the left-hand side of the page is inherently more weighty and more visually powerful than the right-hand side, then it follows that it's going to be typically more pleasing for the viewer to take a very small, very high-weighted visual subject. And boy, does Bob here in this image have a lot of visual weights. High contrast. One of the highest contrast areas of the image is right here, and also just the psychological impact of the archetype of a human being in the shot. It works very well to take Bob and put him far out on the right side and then leverage him in a very dynamic way against the inherently very powerful left-hand side of the page. So there's so many things that are working congruent with this movement that we know about the way people naturally want to move through our images. What's interesting is this is an image, because of that, where when you flip it, for the vast majority of people, if they get a choice between this version and this version is not going to work as well for most people. You can see in this scenario that if you go to the top left, you get stuck in a box that takes you in directions you don't want to go, backwards or up. Easier to go down. You immediately get to a real strong block without much on the other side of it, all up in here, that can carry you past it. This is just an area of the image that can really trap the eye based on the way we typically move through an image. In this case, all of the high value subjects are over here on the left, a part of the image that already has a lot of visual weight, which can really start to tend to keep the viewer over here. You just don't want to go out here as much in this image. And so this idea of the portrait of the super environment dominant portrait of the photographer looking out into the scene doesn't play as well here, because it's harder to get out into these spaces based on the things that we've already mentioned. And instead of this line, sorry about that. I'm not going to re-record this, so this is a vertical version that you're now seeing that we weren't going to look at. So let's go back here. Instead of this line bringing you around in the image in a way that's clockwise, which is the way we typically like to move, it brings you counterclockwise, and so does Bob. Would love to hear your feedback about these ideas, and what I wanted to finish up with saying here is that this is my attitude about design. My attitude about design is, obviously I believe this or I wouldn't teach it most days of the week on the Mindful Eye. It's knowing these things and being conscious of them that gives us the opportunity to be in the driver's seat as an artist. It's talking about them, and then we can decide when we want to make it easy for the viewer, maybe when we want to make it jarring for the viewer, or when we want to throw all these things out of the window. It also can really help us to understand why some images are working over others. And one of the things that I do that I'd really encourage you to do that can help you to see a lot of these things is to take every image that you like enough to work on and to flip it and see how you feel about the image as you flip it back and forth. Can teach you a lot about the kind of movement that we talked about today. Big thank you to Doug for submitting this beautiful image. Big thank you to all the people who participated in our Death Valley National Park workshop. We had a blast. We'd love to see you on a Mindful Eye workshop. And big thank you to you for being here on the Mindful Eye's Daily Critique. Hope to see you again real soon.